It had been 3 months since I'd taken the job as the night shift attendant at the isolated gas station near Mount St. Helens. The small, rundown station was tucked into a corner of nowhere, the perfect place to escape the noise and chaos of the world. No neighbors to worry about, no bustling city streets, just the relentless forest surrounding me and the dark, quiet nights. It felt like a dream come true for someone who'd been living a high-strung city life for years. The town of Ashford was the last stop before heading into the wilderness. It was small, quiet, and had a history of eccentric people who had called it home for generations. The gas station itself was old, barely standing with its cracked concrete and rusting pipes, but it was all I needed. There were no tourists passing through here, and most of the locals seemed to avoid the place entirely, as if they knew better than to linger around. My routine was simple. Fill the tanks, clean the station, and make sure everything was running. The gas station had the occasional visitor, but for the most part, I spent my nights in solitude, taking long walks with my dog, Max, around the property, keeping an eye on the thick woods that began just beyond the station's perimeter. But then came the first Wednesday of the month. It started just like any other evening. The sun dipped low behind the mountains, and I sat inside the small attendance booth, sipping on stale coffee, looking out through the windows at the darkening sky. Max was resting near the back of the station, his ears twitching occasionally as though he heard something I didn't. Around 10 p.m. the sound hit. At first it was just a vibration so subtle that I thought the ground was shaking beneath my feet. But it didn't stop. The low, ominous hum seemed to come from deep within the earth, building in intensity. Max stood up, his tail low between his legs, his ears perked. He didn't bark. He just stood there watching the trees outside, frozen. That's when I knew something was wrong. The sound grew louder, deeper, vibrating the walls of the gas station. It wasn't just a rumble, it was a pressure, a constant, maddening hum that dug into the very marrow of my bones. The lights in the booth flickered, and I stood up instinctively, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. I grabbed the phone to call the local sheriff, but the line was dead. The hum drowned everything out as if it was erasing the very sound of reality around me. Panic surged through me, but I didn't know where to turn. Max growled quietly, his body trembling, the fur along his back standing up. He knew something was coming. The noise reached a crescendo, shaking the entire structure. My heart raced, my hands gripping the counter. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind of panic that freezes your mind. The world outside the gas station blurred. The vibration intensified, and I could hear the rattling of metal. It felt like the station was going to collapse under the weight of it. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the noise stopped. For a moment, there was only the ringing silence in the aftermath. But that silence, it wasn't peaceful. It was wrong, like the air itself was still vibrating from the impact, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Max was the first to break the stillness. He barked once, sharply, before looking back at me with wide, terrified eyes. It was the first time I had seen him this scared, ever. Something was wrong. But I had no idea what. I stepped outside, looking up at the dark sky, trying to understand what had just happened. Nothing. There was no storm, no explanation for the rumble, and no sign of life from the surrounding woods. I was about to go back inside when the phone rang. The sound made me jump, and I hurried inside to answer it. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. It was Robert, the sheriff. "Brian, listen closely," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You heard it, didn't you?" The strange thing was, I wasn't surprised. I didn't even need to ask what he meant. "Yeah," I replied, the words barely leaving my throat. "What was that?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Robert answered. "You'll be hearing it again. It's that time of the month." "What do you mean?" I asked, a cold shiver creeping up my spine. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it, Brian. Every first Wednesday, it happens. We've all learned to live with it. But you won't get used to it. I'm warning you. It's been going on for as long as anyone can remember, and trust me, it's better if you just keep your head down and ignore it. Don't ask too many questions. It's better for you, for everyone." I was speechless, my mind racing. "What do you mean, better for everyone? Who knows about this? What's going on?" Robert's voice grew cold. "The town. Everyone here knows. You're not the first outsider to come in, and you won't be the last. But some things are better left unknown. Understand? Don't make this worse on yourself." The line went silent, and the click of the phone disconnecting felt too final. Too ominous. I stood there in the booth for a moment, Max at my side, staring into the dark night. I had so many questions. What was that noise? Why was everyone in this town so tight-lipped about it? And what the hell had Robert meant by better for everyone? I thought about calling back, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. The next morning I decided to go into town to get some answers if I could. But I quickly realized that Robert wasn't wrong. No one would talk to me about it. Not the gas station owner down the road, not the waitress at the diner, not even the sheriff. It was as if the town was wrapped in a cloak of silence, as if everyone knew, but no one was willing to admit what was really going on. The only thing I could figure out was that the disappearances, the ones everyone had dismissed as accidents, had a deeper connection to whatever it was that was happening every first Wednesday. I had no idea how bad it would get. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the missing persons reports, the strange behavior of the locals, and that unnerving phone call from Robert. Something was wrong in Ashford, and it wasn't just the noise. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to figure out what was going on. The library had given me some clues, but they weren't enough. I needed more, something concrete, something that would tie all the pieces together. The missing people, the first Wednesday noise, the secrecy of the town, it all felt connected, but I was still missing the bigger picture. I decided to start asking questions. I spent the next morning walking around town, trying to catch people off guard. I talked to a few shopkeepers, asking about the disappearances, the noise, anything unusual. But every time I mentioned it, the same thing happened. Silence. The kind of silence that made your skin crawl. People would look away, change the subject, or act like they didn't hear me. I felt like I was speaking to a wall that had been built on decades of secrecy. At the gas station, Max barked incessantly as I closed the front door. I had barely started my shift when I saw Sarah from the diner walking by. I waved at her, hoping to get a conversation started. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You okay?" she asked, noticing my strained expression. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just trying to get a feel for the town. Trying to understand what's going on here." She stiffened at my words, and I noticed her glance nervously at the trees in the distance. "Nothing to understand," she muttered. "This town has its own way of doing things." "Right?" I said, trying to keep my voice light. "That noise last week. Do you know what it is? Everyone seems to just shrug it off." Sarah turned pale at the mention of it. She quickly glanced around as though checking if anyone else was listening, then leaned in closer. "Listen, don't go digging around too much," she whispered. "People don't like it when you ask too many questions. I'm just trying to understand. People are disappearing and no one seems to care. I thought someone would." "Don't. Just don't," she interrupted, shaking her head. Her reaction confused me, but I didn't push. Maybe it was the way she spoke, or maybe it was the way she hurried off, but it all felt too rehearsed. Something wasn't right. I knew I had to keep going, even if it meant ruffling some feathers. As the day wore on, I met a few more locals. But every time I asked about the disappearances, the noise, or anything even remotely related to the strange events in Ashford, they either shut down or changed the subject. I could feel myself getting deeper into something I wasn't prepared for, but I couldn't stop myself. The more I learned, the more I understood that the town was built on secrets that people would kill to keep hidden. That night, unable to shake the eerie feeling from my afternoon, I returned to the library. I had to dig deeper. I couldn't rely on the locals anymore. The only place left to turn was the town's archives, something that might shed light on what was really happening. The librarian Martha had been avoiding me the past few days. I couldn't blame her. People like her knew things. I wasn't sure if she knew more than she was letting on, or if she was scared into keeping quiet. I approached her desk, noticing her nervous glance as I entered. "I need access to your archives," I said quietly, my voice steady. "More specifically, the police reports from the last 20 years. Especially about disappearances." Martha's hand trembled as she adjusted her glasses, but she said nothing at first. She stood and led me to a back room, the smell of dust filling the air as we entered the storage area. Old newspapers, yellowed with age, stacked in towering piles, covered the shelves. I set to work immediately, rifling through the files and folders in front of me. It wasn't long before I found something. The first report came from 1995. A young woman, Jennifer Elmore, had vanished while walking along the outskirts of the town. Her body was never found. I kept flipping through, scanning page after page, and as I did, the dates seemed to line up with the first Wednesday of every month. Each case had the same pattern: outsiders, travelers, or people who weren't tied to the town in any meaningful way. They'd vanish without a trace, only to have their cases quickly closed without any real investigation. It was as though the people of Ashford didn't want to find these missing people, and the authorities didn't push to dig deeper either. I felt a chill creeping down my spine as I realized the terrifying truth. The noise, the disappearances, they weren't a coincidence. Whatever was happening in Ashford was calculated, controlled, and no one was willing to stop it. I made a mental note to keep digging. But I had to be careful. The deeper I went, the more I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a few mysterious disappearances. There was something darker at play, and I was dangerously close to uncovering it. The next morning, after another sleepless night, I headed back to the diner. Trish was behind the counter, but there was something different in her eyes when she saw me. I could feel the weight of her gaze as I walked toward her. "Do you know Jennifer Elmore?" I asked, leaning forward on the counter. Her expression faltered for a split second. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, her voice cool but not without a hint of fear. "I've been reading the police reports. I'm starting to piece things together. I want to know about her." Trish's face tightened. She wiped the counter unnecessarily, her hands moving quicker than usual. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop asking questions about the disappearances," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Some things are better left alone." "But why? Why is everyone so quiet about this?" "There's something going on, Trish. People are disappearing, and I need to know what happened to them." She hesitated, glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to overhear. When she spoke again, her words were slow, deliberate. "You don't understand, Michael. Ashford, it's always been like this. Some things are just better left untouched. Trust me." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and I felt a growing sense of dread sink into my stomach. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The town of Ashford seemed to close in on me as the days dragged on. The more I asked, the more the walls around me thickened, built from lies and silences. Everyone I spoke to brushed me off, acted like the problems I was digging into were too old, too tired to care about. But the thing that gnawed at me, the thing that wouldn't let go, was Jennifer. I'd found her name among the missing. She was young, beautiful, and full of life, until she wasn't. She was like the others. Another face, another body that had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a whisper. But her name, Jennifer Elmore, was different for me. She wasn't just another stranger to the town. She was the girl I grew up with. We were childhood friends. We used to run through these streets, laughing as we raced each other down Main Street, oblivious to the dark things lurking beneath the surface. Now she was gone, swallowed up by the same silence that held the rest of this town hostage. I couldn't shake the thought of her disappearance, and I couldn't ignore the fact that the town had its own rhythm, a dark, cruel rhythm. And it wasn't just about the noise. It was about something far older, far more terrifying. I spent the next few days trying to get answers from people who were around long enough to know the town's secrets. Old men, weathered by years of work and hardship. Their faces were as cracked as the buildings that lined Main Street, and I figured if anyone knew the truth, it would be them. I sat at Murphy's diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the sun bleed through the dusty windows. I wasn't waiting for anyone in particular, but when an elderly man shuffled through the door and took his usual seat at the counter, I knew it was my chance. He was a regular, a man named Frank Saunders. I'd seen him around the town, always alone, always with that far-off look in his eyes, like he was trapped in a memory he couldn't escape. "Morning, Frank," I said, trying to sound casual as I walked over to him. "Mind if I sit?" He barely acknowledged me, his gnarled fingers wrapping around his mug with deliberate care. "Sure. Have a seat." I sat next to him, staring at the black and white checkered floor, trying to think of how to start the conversation without alarming him. I had asked around town, and all the whispers seemed to point to Frank and a few others who'd been here long enough to know what was really happening. "So, Frank," I said slowly, trying to keep my tone light, "I've been doing some digging into the old records. There's been a lot of disappearances in the past, and I wanted to ask you, have you noticed anything strange about the town?" He grunted, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He knew what I was asking, but he didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, his voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in a while. "Strange, huh? What do you think you're looking for, kid? Ain't no strange round here. Just the noise. It's always been like this." "I get that," I replied, leaning in closer. "But what about the disappearances? The ones that seem to happen every month, right after the noise?" Frank didn't look at me. Instead, his eyes focused on the rim of his mug, like he was calculating how much he could say without tipping his hand. He didn't want to talk, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes, like he was trying to decide if he should let me in on a secret that had been buried for too long. "Them disappearances? They ain't just accidents, son. They're part of something bigger. Something you don't want to get tangled in." I could feel my pulse quicken. "What are you talking about?" Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the counter. "Listen, boy. You've been asking the wrong people the wrong questions. You ain't ready for the answers. You don't get it. Jennifer was I cut myself off, realizing I'd said too much too soon. Frank's eyes flickered to me for the first time, and he saw the fire in my eyes. The urgency. The need to know. You think this is about one person? He asked, his voice a rasp. You think Jennifer's the only one to disappear and never come back? You're wrong. And you're asking about something the town's buried for a reason. You're stirring up a hornet's nest, kid. I could feel the weight of his words settle over me like a blanket of dread. There was something deep in Frank's eyes, a knowing look that made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into something terrible. People don't just disappear, I said, my voice quiet. There's got to be a reason. What's going on, Frank? Why does everyone pretend like nothing's happening? Frank set his coffee mug down with a soft clink. I'll tell you, but you won't believe me. None of you ever do. Try me, I said, leaning forward, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked around the diner, his gaze flicking to the door, to the back room, to the windows, as though making sure no one was listening, before finally lowering his voice. Back in the 1940s, the noise started just like it is now. But it wasn't always like this. We didn't know what we were dealing with back then. We thought it was just an earthquake or maybe the wind or something mechanical. But then people started going missing. Not just one or two. It was like a pattern, a regular thing. And over the years we learned what it was. What was it? I asked, barely able to get the words out. They aren't just disappearances, boy. They're sacrifices. I stared at him, waiting for him to go on. But he didn't. His words hung in the air, thick with dread, as if the room itself had grown colder. Sacrifices for what? I whispered. Frank didn't answer right away. He seemed to hesitate, then sighed heavily. For the creatures. The ones that live beneath the mountain. The ones who make the noise. They need to feed. And every month, someone has to be given to them. If they don't, if there's no sacrifice, the town suffers. Worse things happen. Worse things. I repeated, my voice shaking. Frank's face was pale, and his hands trembled as he pushed his coffee mug aside. Yeah, worse things. The noise, it's the warning. And if they don't get what they want, they come for everyone. They come out of the mountain, out of the caves, and they tear this town apart. The blood drained from my face as I absorbed the gravity of his words. He wasn't talking about folklore. He wasn't talking about some small-town superstition. He was talking about real, living monsters, creatures that needed human sacrifices to stay at bay. So, Jennifer, she's the sacrifice for this month? Frank nodded slowly, his eyes filled with sorrow. And next month, someone else will be chosen. That's how it works. You can't stop it, kid. No one can. My mind was spinning, but something inside me refused to believe it. I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't walk away from this. Not after what I'd seen, not after hearing the truth. The creatures, the sacrifices, it was all connected. And Jennifer's disappearance wasn't the first. It was just the beginning. I need to know more, I said, my voice firm now, despite the sick feeling swirling in my gut. Where do they do the sacrifices? How do they choose who goes next? Frank shook his head, his expression grim. You don't want to know. Trust me, you don't. But I did. I had to. I'd already crossed the line. There was no turning back now. The town's secret was mine to uncover, and no matter how dark it got, I wouldn't stop until I understood everything. And deep down, I knew that meant facing whatever lived beneath the mountain. It had been 3 days since Frank Saunders had dropped the truth on me like a ton of bricks. The knowledge that the disappearances weren't random, that the town was sacrificing its own people to keep something far worse at bay, something lurking beneath the ground, had turned my world upside down. Jennifer's disappearance felt like a personal betrayal now, not just another statistic in a long line of lost souls. This was bigger than that. Bigger than anything I'd ever imagined. And I wasn't about to sit back and let it go unanswered. I had to know what lived under Mount St. Helens. I had to find out who was controlling this horrifying cycle. And most importantly, I had to figure out how to stop it. But there was a problem. I couldn't do this alone. That's when I turned to my best friend, David Smith. We'd been close for years. He was the kind of guy you could trust with anything, even the most insane of ideas. He had always been skeptical, pragmatic, a bit of a cynic, but he trusted me even when I told him about Jennifer's disappearance. When I explained what I'd learned, about the sacrifices, the creatures, and the horrible truth, I saw his skepticism flicker for just a moment. But that was all. He agreed to help me, albeit reluctantly. He had his own reasons for staying in this town. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was loyalty. Or maybe it was just that he didn't know what else to do. Together we set out to find the monster's lair. We had nothing but old stories, rumors, and the shaky truths that Frank had passed on to us. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. We walked through the town, gathering information from anyone who would talk to us, though most people just gave us blank stares or changed the subject altogether. This town had been living with its dark secret for decades. They weren't about to let two outsiders expose it now. We started with the woods. It was where the disappearances happened after all. And it was where I knew the creatures would eventually return. I had to know where they lived, what they were capable of. Every part of me screamed to leave, to get away from this town and its cursed history. But I couldn't. Not without answers. As we walked deeper into the forest behind my house, the trees grew denser, the shadows stretching longer. Felt different, darker. The kind of eerie silence that made every sound feel like an intrusion. "Something's wrong here, Brian," David muttered, his eyes scanning the thick underbrush around us. "This doesn't feel natural." "Tell me about it," I replied. My own heart was pounding in my chest, but I wasn't sure if it was fear or excitement. The kind of excitement that could kill you if you let it go too far. We moved in silence for a while, following an old trail I knew well. Charlie, my dog, walked ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging slowly. It was unnerving how quiet everything seemed. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, were absent, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Then we heard it. A distant thud. A low, resonating sound that vibrated in the air. It didn't feel like it came from the trees or the ground or the sky. It felt like it was coming from the very earth beneath our feet. David stopped, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I said, barely a whisper. "What the hell was that?" The sound came again, louder this time. It was a low, resonant boom, followed by an unnatural hum. I could feel it deep in my bones. Something was moving beneath us. We moved closer, more cautiously now. David was looking around, eyes darting between the trees, his breath quickening. The sounds weren't random, they were deliberate, like a warning. I didn't know if we were about to stumble upon the lair of monsters or something else, but I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. Suddenly, Charlie froze. His fur stood on end, his tail stiff. His body was trembling and he started whining softly. The fear in his eyes mirrored mine. Before I could call him back, there was a noise, a low growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. And then, before we could react, a shadow passed over us. I turned just in time to see it. It was huge, too big. Its massive form shuddered as it moved between the trees, its enormous bulk barely fitting between the trunks. Its skin looked like something out of a nightmare, slick and glistening with an oily sheen. The creature had no eyes, just slits where a face should have been. Its body was a grotesque, twisted amalgamation of limbs and appendages, each one longer and more deformed than the last. "Run," David whispered. But it was already too late. The ground beneath us trembled as the creature's monstrous form loomed closer. The trees around us creaked and groaned in protest. And then, out of nowhere, the air turned frigid. I could see my breath misting in front of me, even though it wasn't that cold. David and I ran. But the thing was faster. I could hear it behind us, moving with an inhuman speed, its claws scraping against the ground, dragging itself along with an unnatural grace. It was hunting. And it was hungry. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. David stumbled, almost falling. I reached out, grabbing him, pulling him along. My heart raced in my chest, my lungs burning as we pushed ourselves harder. But no matter how fast we ran, I could hear the thing getting closer. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. We reached the edge of a clearing, gasping for breath, not daring to look back. I didn't know if the creature had lost interest or if it was just waiting for us to make a mistake. But for the moment, we were alive. "Jesus Christ, Brian," David gasped, clutching his chest. "What the hell was that thing?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't know. But it's what they're hiding. And I'm going to find out everything." We stayed in that clearing, recovering for what felt like an eternity. The creature didn't return, but I knew it was out there, somewhere, waiting. And for the first time since I'd started this insane investigation, I realized how dangerous this whole thing was. The townspeople had known. They had been hiding it from us for years. They were part of the ritual, part of the cycle that kept the creatures at bay. They were complicit in the deaths, the disappearances, the sacrifices. And I was beginning to realize that if I didn't stop this now, I would be next. The air grew colder the deeper we descended, and the earthy scent of damp rock mixed with the faint, metallic tang of something ancient. We were in the heart of Mount St. Helens now, far beneath its smoking peak, where the sun's light could never reach. The winding path had led us to the mouth of a cavern, its entrance hidden by a thicket of overgrown brush. The moment I crossed the threshold, the darkness seemed to swallow us whole. Charlie stayed close to me, his fur standing on end, his body stiff with anxiety. Even David, usually unfazed by the world's darkest corners, was silent, his eyes wide and searching the shadows. I tried to focus on the ground beneath my feet, the echo of our footsteps making it feel like the cavern was alive, listening. "How far do you think this goes?" David asked, his voice hushed, almost reverent. "I don't know," I whispered back. "But we're about to find out." We had been searching for days, tracing the oldest rumors, the discarded records, the hints left in the forgotten corners of this cursed town. And every lead had brought us here, into the depths of the earth, to the monsters that had been devouring the souls of Milfield for generations. David's flashlight flickered, casting long, trembling shadows against the uneven walls. I could see his unease reflected in his eyes, though he said nothing. It was too quiet here, too still. Then came the sound, the first unsettling vibration underfoot. I froze. David stopped beside me, his breath shallow. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice strained. "Yeah," I said, my heart racing. "We're not alone." We moved forward more cautiously now. The further we went, the more the air seemed to thicken. It was like breathing through cotton. The walls of the cavern were slick with moisture, and I could feel the temperature dropping by the minute. The silence felt oppressive, until we reached a wide chamber at the cavern's heart. My light swept across it, revealing something I could barely comprehend. The space was vast, far larger than I had anticipated. There were strange stone pillars rising from the ground, blackened by age, the tops shaped into grotesque forms I couldn't quite understand. Some looked like faces, others like twisted, malformed limbs. And then I saw them. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as I stepped forward, the shapes in the shadows became clearer. Monsters. Monsters unlike anything I had imagined. Their bodies were a nightmarish amalgamation of human and insect, each one towering over us, their grotesque limbs writhing in slow, deliberate movements. They were almost twice the size of an average man, long, segmented arms with multiple joints, bodies that seemed to ripple as if something was crawling underneath their skin. But what horrified me more than their size was their eyes. They were eyes that were far too large for their skulls, black and glossy, reflective as if they could absorb light rather than reflect it. There was no emotion in them, only a cold, uncaring emptiness. David whispered something. A curse maybe. But I couldn't hear him over the deafening roar in my head. I had come here looking for answers, but nothing could have prepared me for this. I wanted to run. To turn around and never look back. But my legs refused to move. And before I could even think, the creatures shifted. The air between us seemed to ripple as if reality itself were bending. They stepped forward, their movements impossibly fast, though the sound of their steps was muted, like their massive forms absorbed the very ground beneath them. "Brian." David's voice shook, barely audible. I looked at him and I could see the fear in his eyes. But that wasn't all. There was something else there. Something far more dangerous than the terror he felt for these creatures. It was realization. We were already too deep. There was no way out now. The creatures had cornered us in the heart of their lair, and their hunger was apparent in the way they moved toward us. The stench of rot filled the air, thick and suffocating as if the smell itself was a trap. The monsters opened their mouths, revealing rows of jagged teeth. But what struck me most were their tongues, long dark tendrils that flicked out, tasting the air around us. It was as though they could smell our fear, feel it pulsing in our veins. "David, we need to move," I whispered, my throat dry. But as I took a step back, the ground beneath us trembled again, this time violently, shaking the cavern to its core. I looked up, instinctively shielding my face, and saw something else, something worse. Above us, in the center of the cavern, a massive structure began to move, rising slowly from the floor. It was a stone altar, but not one you would expect to see in a church. This one was large enough to fit 24 people, maybe more. It was covered in carvings, deep, intricate lines that twisted into shapes I could barely comprehend. The monsters watched it as if it was a source of their power. And from the altar, I felt it, the faintest pulse of energy, like a heartbeat echoing through the cavern walls. They needed sacrifices. I understood then. They didn't just want our blood, they wanted our souls. Their hunger wasn't simply for sustenance. It was for power. These creatures, these ancient beings, were feeding off the sacrifices the town had been making for decades. And they weren't just killing. They were feeding. David's face paled. "They need more, don't they?" I nodded grimly. Jennifer wasn't the last one. The creatures moved again, their eyes never leaving us, and that's when I realized it. This wasn't just about feeding. This was a cycle. A ritual. Every month they took what they needed, feeding off a sacrifice, and in return they allowed the town to remain untouched, unharmed. They kept the town alive. But now they were getting stronger. And I was next. I turned to David, my voice shaking with the cold truth. We need to stop this. We have to stop them before they kill anyone else. Before they kill us. But I knew deep down that there was no stopping this. Not now. Not after what we had discovered. And before I could speak again, I heard it. A loud, unearthly growl echoed from the far side of the cavern. The other creatures had gathered, and they were closing in on us. There would be no more talking, no more searching for answers. There was only survival. Only one way out. The creatures lunged and everything went black. The deeper we ventured into the heart of the cavern, the more distorted the world around us became. At first it was subtle. A slight shift in the air pressure, the dimming of the light as if something was absorbing it. The ground beneath us began to feel like it was made of something softer than stone, almost liquid in its consistency. The walls pulsed, not with movement but with a rhythm like a heartbeat. The air was thick, too thick, and it pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. David was ahead of me, his face set in a grimace. He was moving faster than I was, like something was urging him forward. I couldn't understand it. This wasn't just an ordinary cavern. The atmosphere had shifted. The space around us felt like a dream, something unreal, as though the very essence of time and space had been manipulated here. As we neared the center of the cavern, where the altar had risen from the ground, I felt it, the oppressive weight of something ancient, something malevolent. And as much as I wanted to look away, I couldn't. My eyes were drawn to the altar, to the carvings that twisted and curled in ways that defied logic. David stopped. "Look," he whispered, his voice tense. I followed his gaze. At first I saw nothing unusual, just the altar, the massive stone structure that had risen from the depths of the earth. But as my eyes focused, I realized something was wrong. The carvings on the altar were shifting. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the shapes began to move. The symbols that had seemed so fixed, so permanent, were not static at all. They warped and flowed like ink in water, changing with every blink of my eyes. I took a step closer, drawn by the strange, hypnotic movements. The air seemed to shift with every motion of the symbols, and I could feel a strange pull in my chest, as if the altar was calling to me. Then the ground trembled. Not just beneath our feet, but within me. I felt a vibration deep in my bones, a low hum that resonated through every muscle, every fiber of my being. My head swam and I had to grip the cold stone to keep myself upright. And then it happened. The creatures, the monsters that had been watching us from the shadows, stirred. They rose from their lair, their massive forms moving with terrifying grace, their eyes locked on us. But something was different. They weren't coming toward us. They were looking at the altar, at the symbols, their bodies undulating with anticipation. I felt the dread surge inside me, but it was more than just fear. It was the overwhelming sense that I had stumbled upon something much bigger than I could comprehend. These creatures, they weren't just feeding off the sacrifices. They weren't just manipulating the townspeople to ensure their survival. They were bending reality itself. "Brian," David said, his voice trembling, "do you see it?" I didn't answer immediately. My eyes were fixated on the altar. And that's when I understood. The creatures were not just alive, they were time manipulators. The altar wasn't just a sacrificial platform, it was a conduit for their power. They weren't just feeding off the people they consumed, they were absorbing them, taking their essence, warping their time, creating new realities in which they reigned. The air felt thinner as I approached the altar, my legs shaky, my mind struggling to process the enormity of what was happening. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched one of the symbols on the altar. Immediately, the world around me shattered. It wasn't like a typical break, like glass cracking. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn open. I saw flashes of other places, other times, all unfolding in an instant. The cavern I stood in splintered into different dimensions, some where the monsters ruled, some where the town of Milfield was still thriving, unaware of the horrors lurking beneath. And in those realities I saw the people who had disappeared, but not as they once were. They were twisted versions of themselves, their bodies contorted into serval shapes, their eyes black with emptiness. I pulled my hand back in horror, stumbling backward. David didn't seem as shocked as I was. His expression was unreadable, as though he had been prepared for this moment. "We can't stop it," he muttered. "We've known this, Brian. This is how it's always been." I turned to him, my mind still reeling. "What are you talking about? You knew about this?" But before I could finish, David stepped forward, his face now shadowed with a mixture of resignation and dread. "I'm sorry, Brian. I didn't want you to get involved, but it's too late. You're already part of it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? What do you mean I'm part of it?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, faded piece of paper. A map, one I hadn't seen before, but it looked familiar, almost like something I had seen in the library. "This," he said, handing it to me. "This is the map to the core of the ritual. The altar, the creatures, the everything. It's how we keep the balance, Brian. How we survive." I looked at him, horrified. You've been a part of this? For how long?" David sighed, rubbing his face with a hand that trembled. "A long time, Brian. I didn't have a choice. I was chosen. It's how it works. The town, the people, it's all part of the ritual. Each month, a new sacrifice. But it's not just for them. It's for us too." I shook my head, my stomach churning with disgust. "This is wrong. All of it. The missing people, the sacrifices, the monsters. We can't just let this continue." David's gaze hardened. "You don't understand. We have to. We've kept it secret for so long. If you start asking too many questions, if you try to expose it, you'll ruin everything. You don't know what they're capable of, Brian. These creatures, they're not just monsters. They can twist time. They can erase people from history altogether. And if we don't feed them, if we don't keep the cycle going..." His voice trailed off. I could feel the cold sweat on my brow. "What happens?" "They come," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They come for everyone. They'll destroy the entire town, and worse, they'll take those who try to escape. They'll wipe them from existence." I was breathing harder now, struggling to comprehend his words. But it wasn't just the revelation that shook me. It was the deep, haunting truth behind it all. We weren't just dealing with a cult or a group of people committing murder to survive. We were dealing with something that had the power to warp reality itself. And David, my closest friend, had been a part of it all along. Suddenly, the ground beneath us shook again. This time, the tremor was stronger, and I heard the distant rumble of something deep beneath the earth. The monsters were stirring. I looked at David, my mind racing. "We have to stop them, David. We have to end this before it's too late." David's eyes softened, but there was no remorse there. "You don't get it, Brian. It is too late. You're already part of the ritual now." Before I could react, the air around us shifted again. The monsters were here, and their eyes were fixed on us. The altar had started to glow, and the symbols, those cursed, terrible symbols, were calling to them. They were hungry, and I was the next offering. The cavern had grown colder, the air thick with an unnatural chill as we ventured deeper into the lair of the creatures. My heart pounded in my chest, a heavy thud echoing in my ears as the realization of what I was facing began to take hold. The monsters, those vile entities that had haunted this land for generations, were just a fraction of the terror that surrounded me now. The real horror was the town of Milfield itself, the twisted pact that had been formed centuries ago, the sacrifice, the ritual, the conspiracy. And now I was a part of it. David, my closest friend, had always been my anchor in this madness, the one person I could trust in a town that seemed to hold so many secrets. But as we approached the heart of the altar, something shifted in him. His movements were colder, more deliberate, and his gaze, once filled with uncertainty, was now steely and resolute. I turned to him, my voice filled with desperation. "David, we have to stop this. We can't let it continue." He didn't respond immediately. The tremors underfoot grew stronger. I could hear the creatures stirring in the distance. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the stone walls of the cavern, signaling that their hunger was awake. David paused, his back to me now as he walked ahead. I followed him, pushing past the rising panic in my chest, until we reached a narrow passageway. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the ritualistic markings on the walls. Symbols like those I'd seen on the altar were etched deep into the stone. This was the heart of it, the place where the town's dark history began. "David," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. "What is this place?" He turned to face me then, his eyes cold, his expression unreadable. "This is where it all began, Brian. Where the first pact was made." I shook my head, confusion clouding my thoughts. "What do you mean? You can't possibly think we should keep feeding them, these things?" David's face hardened. "You still don't get it, do you? It was never about them. It's about us, our survival, the town's survival. Everything we've built, everything we've known, none of it would be here without the ritual, without the sacrifices." I froze, his words sinking in like a cold blade through my heart. What are you talking about? You've been a part of this? You've been sacrificing people all this time? David's jaw clenched. We all have. The town has always known, Brian. The noise, the disappearances, it's been happening for decades. And it will continue because if we stop, if we try to change it, everything will collapse. I felt my stomach churn. The weight of what he was saying crushed me. The townspeople, the people I'd thought were innocuous, were complicit. Every month, every first Wednesday they participated in the ritual, and they had for generations. And now it was my turn. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to run. But deep down, I knew there was no escaping it. The monsters were too powerful and the town too entrenched in the system. My mind raced, searching for any shred of hope, but there was none. David stepped forward, his movements now slow and deliberate. You were always going to be part of this, Brian. It was never a matter of choice. You were chosen long before you even set foot in Milfield. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Chosen? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. David nodded, his eyes dark with the weight of everything he had witnessed over the years. The creatures, they are what sustain us. We keep the town alive, the town keeps the monsters fed. It's the only way it works. If we stop the ritual, everything falls apart. People leave, businesses close, the town dies. We all die. I backed away, my heart racing as a cold sweat drenched my body. You're saying that this, I gestured to the cavern, the altar, the very ground beneath us. Asterisk is the only way to survive? To feed them people every month. David didn't flinch. His voice was low, almost sorrowful. You've seen the reports. You've seen the disappearances. You know what happens to those who try to leave. They never make it out. The creatures, they'll take you. They'll erase you. And then they'll come for the rest. I felt a chill sweep over me. The air seemed to grow even colder, the shadows longer. The walls, the symbols, they were all pressing in on me now. The reality of it, the suffocating weight of the truth, was crushing. I turned my eyes toward the altar, the symbols that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. They were alive, hungry, demanding. The creatures, those nightmares of flesh and bone, were waiting. And I knew deep in my gut that it was too late. I couldn't fight this. I couldn't stop them. David's voice broke through the fog of my thoughts. You're going to have to accept it, Brian. We've all accepted it. And in a few hours you'll understand why it has to be this way. You'll be part of the cycle. You'll be the one who keeps it going. I stumbled backward, my body trembling with disbelief. No, I won't let you do this to me. You can't. But before I could finish, the ground beneath us shuddered violently. The air grew thick, stifling, and then the growls came. Deep, guttural sounds, like the very earth was rumbling in response to the creatures stirring below. David didn't move. His eyes never left me. It's time. Suddenly I was grabbed from behind. The force of it took me by surprise. Two figures, local men, faces twisted in grim recognition, stepped forward, their hands like iron around my arms. David stepped back as though giving them space to move me. His face remained unreadable. But in his eyes I saw something I couldn't place. Something darker than I had ever seen. You can't do this. I gasped, struggling, my heart pounding in my chest. David's expression softened for a brief moment. I'm sorry, Brian. This is the only way. You have to understand. We all have our parts to play. The world around me blurred as they dragged me toward the altar, toward the very heart of the ritual. The creatures' growls grew louder, and I could hear the sound of their massive forms shifting in the dark. The air grew colder still until it felt like the very marrow in my bones was freezing. I fought harder, pushing back against them, but the men were strong and their grip was unrelenting. No, I screamed. I won't be your sacrifice. But it was no use. As I was brought to the altar, I saw the faces of the townspeople watching from the shadows. They stood in silence, unmoving as if witnessing the inevitable. David stood to the side, watching, his face a mask of resolve. But there was no sympathy in his eyes. No regret. The last thing I saw before they bound me to the altar were the creatures, the monsters, emerging from the darkness. Their forms were monstrous, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. They were massive, larger than any human, their bodies contorted in shapes that defied nature. And in that moment I knew the truth. They didn't just feed on fear. They fed on the souls of the people they consumed, using them to fuel their power, to bend reality to their will. I was nothing but another offering. Another part of the system. Another piece in the puzzle that kept Milfield alive. And then everything went dark. I could feel the weight of the cold stone pressing against my back as they dragged me to the altar. My hands were bound tightly, the rough ropes cutting into my wrists, the cold air stinging against my skin. The sound of the creatures, those abominations lurking just beyond the shadows, was deafening. Their growls vibrated through the ground beneath me, like an earthquake waiting to tear everything apart. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat echoing the terror that gripped me. David stood just out of reach, his face a mask of indifference. His eyes met mine, but there was nothing in them. No guilt, no remorse. Just emptiness. It was as if I was already dead to him. And in a way, I suppose I was. "You're making a mistake," I gasped, my voice hoarse from struggling, but they didn't even flinch. The two men who had grabbed me and dragged me here were still standing nearby, their expressions blank. There was no fear in their eyes, no hesitation. Only the cold certainty that this was how it had to be. But I couldn't just give in. Not yet. My mind raced as I tried to think of something, anything that could get me out of this. The ground shook again, louder this time. The monsters, they were hungry, and I was the next meal. Suddenly, as the stone of the altar pressed deeper into my back, my eyes locked onto something. A shape half hidden by shadow. A small glimmer of light reflected off a polished surface beneath a thick layer of moss. It was a rune carved into the ground at the base of the altar, ancient symbols interwoven with patterns I had seen in my research, yet something about it felt different, powerful, as if it had been placed there to keep something in check, something dark and dangerous. Without thinking, I shifted my body slightly, pulling at the ropes, feeling the edges loosen just enough to allow me to move my arms. Every second felt like an eternity, the monsters getting closer with every passing moment, their guttural growls rising, reverberating through the air. But I couldn't give up. I wouldn't. My fingers brushed against the rune, the cold stone cool under my touch, but it hummed with an energy that sent a jolt of panic through me. Felt alive. I pressed harder, my desperation outweighing the fear that threatened to consume me. The sound of the growls grew louder, and I could feel the ground vibrating beneath me. The monsters were almost here. "David!" I shouted, panic flooding my voice. "David, please, you can't let this happen." For a moment he hesitated. His eyes flickered toward me, but there was no sign of hesitation in his stance. He was still just standing there, watching, waiting for the inevitable. And that's when I realized. This wasn't just a ritual. It wasn't just some twisted system to keep the town alive. No, it was far worse. David, he had been part of this for so long, part of something so deeply ingrained that even the thought of breaking it was impossible for him. The town, the people, the authorities, they were all complicit. They'd turned the act of murder into a necessity, and it had been this way for decades, maybe centuries. A cycle that had been in place for so long that no one even questioned it anymore. But I wasn't like them. I wasn't going to be a part of it. I took a deep breath and pushed harder against the rune, using every ounce of my strength. There was a sudden crack, a burst of energy, and the ground shook violently. The stones beneath me split open with a loud crack, and I could feel the monster's presence shifting, like a wave of darkness pulling back just for a moment. For a brief second, everything stopped. The creature's growls turned into something more like shrieks. The men standing nearby turned in confusion, their eyes wide with fear for the first time since I'd arrived. This was my chance. I ripped my hands free, the rope finally snapping as the energy from the rune surged through me. I had no idea what I had done, but I didn't wait to figure it out. I stumbled to my feet, ignoring the pain that shot through my legs as I ran toward the narrow passage behind the altar. "David!" I shouted again, but this time he didn't respond. He was paralyzed, staring at the altar as the monster's furious roars shook the ground around us. He didn't even flinch as I ran, his eyes still empty, still distant. I had to move. I sprinted down the dark passage, my heart racing, every step filled with terror and adrenaline. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the walls closing in on me as the tunnel twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the belly of the mountain. My feet slipped on the slick stone floor, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The roar of the creatures grew louder, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground beneath me. I reached a fork in the tunnel and hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to keep going, but I didn't know which way to take. The noise, the terrifying primal noise, was almost deafening now. Suddenly, I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, panic rising, only to see a figure emerge from the shadows. It was David. But something was wrong. His eyes were wide with something I couldn't identify. Hunger? Hatred? But there was something more. I felt the dread settle in my stomach like a stone. "David!" I whispered, backing away, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking toward me, his steps slow and deliberate, his face completely emotionless. "David, no." I pleaded, my voice breaking. Please, you don't have to do this. But it was already too late. I turned and ran, the darkness swallowing me as I pushed forward, desperately trying to escape. I heard him behind me, the sound of his footsteps quickening, but I didn't dare look back. I wasn't just running from the creatures anymore. I was running from the truth. I finally reached the end of the tunnel, where the faint light of the moon filtered through cracks in the rock above. But before I could escape, I felt hands grab me from behind, slamming me against the cold stone wall. David's face was inches from mine now, his breath hot and rancid in my ear. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but the words were clear. You can't escape it, Brian. You never could. I struggled against his grip, but it was no use. The weight of everything I had learned, the monsters, the sacrifices, the twisted ritual that had ensnared everyone in Milfield, was too much. My body was weak, my resolve shattered. David leaned in closer, his lips brushing against my ear. It's over. With a final, desperate effort, I pushed him away, managing to break free of his grip. But my body was weak, my legs failing beneath me. I stumbled and fell to the ground, gasping for breath as the world spun around me. And then I heard it. The creatures, their enormous, hulking forms emerging from the shadows. Their growls echoed through the tunnel, deafening. It was too late. I tried to get up, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt something heavy and cold wrap around me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I was helpless, trapped in this nightmare I had unwittingly stumbled into. And as the monsters closed in around me, I knew that I was just another sacrifice, another part of Milfield's gruesome, unbreakable cycle. It was over. The air inside the cave was thick, almost tangible as I moved deeper into the labyrinth beneath the earth. My flashlight's beam flickered against the walls, revealing strange symbols carved into the jagged rock. Some were too familiar, the same ones I had seen all over Milfield in every hidden corner of the town's history, but others were new. They pulsed faintly as if alive. A sickening shiver crawled up my spine as I traced one with my finger. The touch felt wrong, as if I had awakened something dormant within the stone itself. I had found the first rune by accident, buried under a pile of debris in a remote cave behind the mountain, but now it felt as though the runes were calling to me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling in my chest was undeniable. I was meant to find them. The monsters had left their marks everywhere, their influence seeping into the very bones of the land. For days I had been unraveling the pattern, tracing the symbols back through town records and ancient manuscripts. I had hoped the knowledge would bring me some peace, some understanding of what these things were, but instead, it only brought me closer to the truth. And that truth was more horrifying than anything I had ever imagined. I had started to see things. At first, they were subtle, shadows in the corner of my vision, fleeting glimpses of movement when I was alone. But the longer I stayed in Milfield, the worse it got. I could feel their presence, always just behind me, waiting. I didn't want to believe it at first, but I had no choice. The monsters didn't just exist in the physical world. They were in the minds of everyone in Milfield. They had entered our thoughts, made themselves part of us. They manipulated the town with an unseen hand, slowly feeding off our fears and our guilt. The missing people? The disappearances? It wasn't just a byproduct of their need for sacrifices, it was part of the process. They needed us to forget. They needed us to be complicit. And now, the worst part, they were inside my mind. I hadn't told anyone what I had discovered. Not David, not the townspeople, and especially not the authorities. Not because I didn't trust them, but because the more I learned, the more I realized that everyone knew. The town had been complicit for so long that they were too terrified to even speak about it. It was as if the very thought of the creatures made their bodies freeze, their minds turn numb. Everyone from the old town council to the youngest children had been conditioned to accept the monster's rule. But as I moved deeper into the cave, I started to feel their influence more strongly. It was as if they were reaching into my mind, weaving themselves into the fabric of my thoughts. My heart raced, my breath quickened. The deeper I went, the harder it became to tell what was real and what was in my head. I stopped walking for a moment, trying to clear my thoughts, but the darkness in the cave felt alive, watching. There was something about it, something oppressive that pressed down on me. The shadows twisted unnaturally, and the symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer, as though they were moving of their own accord. I reached out to touch one, but the moment my hand made contact, everything went still. The sudden silence felt wrong. The cave had always been alive with sounds, the drip of water, the rustling of small creatures in the distance, the steady echo of my own footsteps. But now there was only a thick, suffocating silence. I looked down at my hand, expecting to see blood, but instead, the stone beneath my fingers writhed, the surface pulsing like a heartbeat. I pulled my hand back sharply, my head spinning. The symbols weren't just symbols, they were alive, part of a larger, sinister entity. They were feeding on me. A voice broke the silence, but it wasn't in the air. It was in my head. "You're closer now, Brian." I froze, my stomach sinking. The voice wasn't just in my head, it was familiar. It was David's voice, distorted and twisted by the darkness. "You can't escape now," it continued, each word like a knife in my mind. "You're already part of the game." My vision blurred as the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, the walls of the cave stretching and contorting. The monsters weren't physical beings anymore, they were thoughts. They were inside me, inside everyone in Milfield, puppeteering our every move, our every thought. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My lips moved, but only a soft, raspy breath escaped. The cold, the shadows, the whispers, they were all part of their design. The monsters didn't need to physically touch you. They just needed to make you doubt your own reality, to twist your perception until you couldn't tell what was real anymore. I stumbled back, my legs giving way beneath me. My body collided with the wall of the cave, but I couldn't focus. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder than the voice, louder than everything. The voice in my head twisted again. "You're too weak, Brian. You've always been too weak. You couldn't fight it, and now we have you." I shook my head, trying to push the voice away. "No, this isn't real. None of this is real." But even as I thought it, I felt the weight of their presence closing in around me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. My eyes were blurring, my thoughts scattering, breaking into pieces that didn't make sense. The voice rose to a maddening crescendo. "You are ours now. The sacrifices, the blood, it all leads to this moment. You will become one of us, Brian. And soon everyone else will too." I fell to my knees, hands clutching at the floor, gasping for air. But it was too late. I had already lost. The monsters had won, and there was no escaping them. They were in my mind, in my blood, and soon they would be in everyone else's. The world around me shifted again, the walls of the cave closing in, collapsing in on themselves as the reality I had known shattered into 1,000 pieces. The monsters were here, and they were using me, using all of us, to bring their nightmare into the world. And now, I was just another part of their game. Another puppet in their twisted world. But I couldn't give up yet. I couldn't let them win. I wouldn't. Somewhere in the dark corners of my mind, a plan began to form. If I could just hold on a little longer, if I could just survive long enough, I could still fight back. But for now, the monsters had taken control. And all I could do was try to survive long enough to find a way out. If there even was one. I awoke to the sound of my own ragged breathing, the dark cave surrounding me as if it were closing in, an ever-tightening noose. My body felt heavy, a thick blanket of exhaustion weighing me down as I struggled to focus. The voice that had tortured me before had gone silent, leaving me with nothing but the overwhelming sense of dread that had been growing within me for days. The shadows in the cave had a life of their own, creeping along the walls like silent hunters, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had thought I was running from the monsters, from the people who had betrayed me, but now I understood. There was no running. There was no escape. David had always been there for me. Or so I thought. We'd been friends since childhood, and I had trusted him with everything, even when he began to grow distant. His strange behavior had started months ago, an unease in his eyes whenever I pressed him for answers. Now I realized it wasn't just his avoidance. It was the system. The same system that had bound the entire town to the dark rituals beneath Mount St. Helens. David had been part of it all along. A willing participant in the horror that had claimed so many lives before me. I thought I had learned the truth, but I had barely scratched the surface. The realization hit me like a gut punch. Everyone in Milfield knew. The old, silent locals, the people at the diner, the ones who pretended nothing was wrong, it was all part of a twisted web of deception. They had been feeding these monsters, these creatures, for decades, offering up the innocent to keep their town from falling to the terror lurking beneath the earth. They used us, me, as pawns in a sickening game of survival. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, to shake the truth from my head, but it was useless. The more I struggled, the clearer it became. The town itself had become an offering, a place where the monsters fed on human suffering, where every first Wednesday of the month, someone had to die. Someone had to disappear. And now it was my turn. I stood up slowly, my legs weak and trembling beneath me. The cave stretched out endlessly before me, and I could hear the faintest rustling in the distance, footsteps. They were coming for me. The townspeople, led by David. They had come to collect their prize, to complete the ritual, to offer me to the monsters so they could feed again. The weight of it crushed me. The knowledge that this wasn't some unfortunate series of events, it was planned. Every single step of it, every disappearance, every life lost had been part of a larger design. There was no escape. I had spent so long trying to understand, trying to unravel the mystery, but the truth was simple: they were never meant to be stopped. They were always in control, and now I had become a part of the cycle. There was no heroic escape. There was no last-minute triumph. The moment I stepped into Milfield, the moment I uncovered the first clue, my fate had been sealed. As I stumbled through the cave trying to find some shred of hope, I thought back to the first time I heard the noise. The deafening sound that shook the town to its core, the feeling of helplessness that had taken over my every nerve. At that moment I had thought it was just an anomaly, a random event. But it wasn't. It had been a warning. A harbinger of the inevitable, of what would come if the sacrifices weren't made. I'd been running from the truth, hiding behind my investigation, but I hadn't seen it for what it was. A trap. The footsteps grew louder. There was no hiding from them now. I could hear David's voice faintly, but it wasn't the man I had once known. It was deeper, colder, as if his very soul had been corrupted by the creatures he had been feeding. "You can't hide, Brian. You were always meant to be part of this," his voice echoed, twisted by the cavern. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. How could he say that? How could he know? The truth hit me like a freight train. They weren't just taking people for the monsters. No, they were feeding the creatures to survive. And every time someone disappeared, the town got closer to becoming something else, something that couldn't be saved. They needed the monsters to keep feeding. They had been doing this for so long that they had convinced themselves it was normal, that it was the only way. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I heard the approaching voices getting closer, their footsteps louder now. David was leading them, leading me to my death. His betrayal had already been planned, already part of the design. He had known this day would come. And now I was going to be a part of it. The cave opened into a vast chamber. I didn't want to look, didn't want to face the reality of what lay beyond. But as I entered the cavern, I saw them, the monsters. They weren't like anything I had imagined. They were not the twisted, shadowy creatures from my nightmares. They were bigger, larger than life itself, their forms not entirely of this world. Their shapes bent and distorted, rippling like a nightmare-made flesh. Their eyes burned with an unnatural hunger, and I could feel their power, their ancient, endless desire for blood. They were hungry, and I was their next meal. I tried to back away, but the weight of their presence, their stare, paralyzed me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. David's voice came again, this time closer, more insistent. "You were always meant to be part of this, Brian. You're the sacrifice." I turned, my eyes wide with fear as I saw David and the others from Milfield. They stood in the shadows, waiting for the monsters to feast. They didn't look at me like I was a person. They looked at me like I was prey, like I was already gone. "It's time," David said. The monster's eyes fixed on me, and I realized too late that there was no way out. No escape. No fight left to be won. They reached for me, and in that moment I understood. I had been part of the game from the beginning. And there was no way out. There never had been. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something metallic that I couldn't place. The walls of the cavern seemed to pulse with a life of their own, like they were breathing, exhaling with the monstrous creatures that lurked within. I had known this day would come, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of it. It was a sickening truth that clawed at the edges of my mind, pulling me deeper into despair with each passing moment. I was trapped. The entire town of Milfield, my so-called home, had already sealed my fate. The people who I had once called neighbors, friends, and even family were the ones who had sentenced me to this hell. They had made their peace with the monsters that ruled this town, and now I was to be the next sacrifice. David, my best friend, the one person who had been with me through it all, was the one who had led me here. I should have seen it sooner, I should have known, but I had been too blind, too caught up in my search for answers. The truth was too monstrous to comprehend. Now, standing in the heart of the cavern, I felt my stomach churn as I realized that this was the end. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift as though it too was alive, part of the twisted ecosystem that had been feeding off of human suffering for so long. It was inescapable. No matter how much I had fought, how many answers I had uncovered, the truth had always been right here, waiting for me to fall into its grasp. I had thought I would be able to find a way to stop this, to destroy the monsters or expose the truth, but now I understood. This was bigger than me. It had been happening for decades, centuries even. The cycle of death, the sacrifices, it had been woven into the very fabric of Milfield. The people here had been born into this nightmare. They had accepted it, embraced it even because it had kept them alive. And now it was my turn to feed the monsters. The roar of the creatures echoed through the cave, shaking the walls as they stirred from their slumber. They were huge, bigger than any animal, any nightmare I had ever imagined. Their bodies rippled with a grotesque power, a raw hunger that could never be satisfied. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and as they turned to face me, I could feel their gaze pierce through me, stripping me of my will to fight. I tried to back away, but my legs felt weak, unresponsive. The weight of the knowledge, the truth, was suffocating. The monsters were drawing closer, their twisted forms shifting in the dim light, their sharp claws scraping against the stone floor. Their mouths opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that could tear through bone like paper. David stood beside me, his face empty of emotion, his eyes cold. "You should have known this would happen," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the deafening sound of the creatures. "You were always going to be the next one." I wanted to scream, to shout at him, to ask why he had done this, why he had betrayed me. But the words caught in my throat. There was no point. I had no fight left in me. The horror of the past few weeks, the terror of discovering the truth, the realization that I had never stood a chance, had drained me of everything. My body, my soul, my very spirit, everything was being consumed by this nightmare. The creatures were almost upon me now, their towering forms casting shadows that stretched across the cavern. They moved with an unnatural grace, their steps light but deliberate, as though they were savoring every moment of my impending doom. One of them, the largest, the one that seemed to be their leader, reached out with its grotesque clawed hand. It moved with terrifying speed, and before I could even react, I felt its cold fingers wrap around my throat, lifting me off the ground. The air left my lungs in a sharp gasp, and I tried to claw at the hand, but it was useless. My body was paralyzed, my thoughts blurred as I struggled to comprehend what was happening. The pain, the coldness, the terror, it was overwhelming. I was nothing more than a lamb being led to slaughter. David stood there watching, his face devoid of expression. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He was a part of this, a willing participant in the ritual that had been happening for so long. The creature's grip tightened, and I felt the world spinning around me. My vision darkened as I struggled to breathe, but it was no use. Everything was slipping away. And then, just as I thought I might lose consciousness, I heard a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper in the back of my mind. "You have to stop them." I tried to focus, tried to make sense of the words, but the grip around my throat tightened again, and I was pulled back into the abyss of pain and fear. The creature's claws dug deeper into my flesh, and I could feel the blood drain from my body. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision blurring. I was slipping away, and with it, the last remnants of hope. But even in the darkness, I couldn't let go. I had to fight. I had to find a way out. The last thing I saw before the world went black was David, standing in the shadows, watching as I was pulled into the monstrous maw of the creatures. The last thing I heard was the roar of the monsters as they claimed me, as they feasted on my soul, ensuring that their ritual would continue for another cycle. And as I was consumed by the darkness, I realized something. There was no escape. There was no redemption. There was only the cycle, the endless, unbreakable cycle of death and sacrifice. And now I was a part of it forever. Time moves on, but nothing ever really changes. I can feel it now, even in the dark recesses of the place I've come to know as my final resting place. The cold, the crushing silence, the air thick with the weight of a truth I never could have fully understood until now. Even death can't free me from the cycle. I am now part of the machinery of Milfield, just like the others before me and the ones who will come after. The monsters have feasted on my soul, and in the grotesque quiet that follows their ravenous hunger, I realize something. This is not just a town, not just a place where people live out their days. It's a trap. A machine of ancient, unfathomable design that feeds on the lives of outsiders, on the flesh of the innocent. We were never meant to leave. None of us. Not even me. I feel the pull now, a presence in the deep corners of my mind. A part of me lingers, watching through the veil, seeing the town with new eyes. I see the cracks in the facade, the cracks I never noticed when I was still alive, still human. I thought I had understood it all, this town, the monsters, the unspoken rules. But now I know. The sacrifice of one person is never enough. They need more. More to keep the balance, to ensure that the cycle continues. Milfield is a parasite, and we, the people, are both the food and the nourishment. Time moves on. The monster's hunger is never sated. They remain restless, their twisted forms curled in the depths beneath the volcano, their colossal bodies more than any human could comprehend. They've always been here waiting, feeding. This town, this cursed place, is their perfect home. The deep fissures beneath the mountain connect to places where the fabric of reality begins to fray. Here, the line between the living and the dead is thin, and it is easy to slip from one world to the next. I hear the voices now. They speak to me, but it is not my name they call. I was never meant to have a name anymore. I am part of them, a puppet without strings. A fleeting whisper in a never-ending chorus. I can't escape them. The wind outside rustles through the trees. It's the first Wednesday of the month again. It's time. Milfield doesn't change. The noise will come just as it always does. The houses will shake, the windows will rattle, and people will cower in their homes, too frightened to go out, too frightened to ask questions. The ritual has begun once more. And though I'm no longer among the living, I feel it. I feel it in the very bones of the town. I am part of the ritual now. My sacrifice wasn't just mine, it was theirs too. The others, the ones who have come before me, wait in the shadows just as I do. We are the restless souls, the ones that will forever be part of the terrible price Milfield pays to continue its existence. Every first Wednesday, another will join us. Another soul to feed the beast. Another life to turn into a number, a name in a report lost to time. David, he was supposed to be my friend. But he wasn't. He was just another piece of the puzzle, a willing participant in the machine that churns on, indifferent to human morality. Nothing has changed. As the minutes tick by, I feel the pull. I see the monsters stirring again beneath the mountain, their grotesque forms shifting in the dark corners of the earth. They've waited for the next cycle to begin, and now they are hungry once again. In the living world, it is happening as it always has. The town prepares itself. They're already watching. Already waiting. The next victim is already chosen. Milfield breathes. I can hear the footsteps of the chosen one. They don't know yet, but they will soon. The town will act like nothing is wrong. They'll carry on with their lives until the ritual calls to them, until the noise shakes their bones and reminds them that they are part of something far bigger than themselves. As I wait, I feel an overwhelming sense of dread. Who will it be this time? The victims are always the same, strangers, outsiders who have no connection to the town. They come in, unaware of the dark heart that beats beneath the surface. They are the perfect sacrifices because they are expendable. Their lives don't matter to the people here, not the way mine used to matter to me. The cycle continues. I see it now with perfect clarity. The monsters, the ritual, the sacrifice, it's all a carefully constructed system designed to ensure that the town survives at the cost of others. And I am a part of it now, just as the others are. We're all here, waiting in the dark corners of the world, forgotten and ignored, feeding the horrors that lurk beneath Milfield. The town will never change. No one will ever stop the monsters. They will always need more sacrifices to survive, and we, the lost souls of Milfield, are the price. And so it continues. The first Wednesday. The noise. The sacrifice. The ritual. Endlessly. I'm no longer a person, no longer human. I am part of the endless cycle that defines Milfield. And when the time comes, as it always does, I will watch the next victim fall into the trap. And the cycle will begin again. The town lives on, but its soul has long since died. And so, it begins once more.